Okay, welcome everyone to this discussion on Logiciel. It's kind of a change of pace compared to the two previous Zoom discussions that we had. One was on dynamical systems theory, and the other was specifically focused on Steve Grossberg's work. This book has very little neuroscience in it. It does mention some neuroscience, but it's mostly about computation. So it's a philosophy book. It's asking what's the nature of computation, and kind of navigating between a lot of pitched positions about in the philosophy of computation. And I read it a couple of months ago and found it quite exciting. It links to a lot of maybe pretty abstract ideas that people who don't have much of a background in pure math and computer science often just don't ever get exposed to. And I thought it would be nice to kind of just bring it out there, since computation is such an important tool and kind of even just buzzword. I think it's good for even people without like the technical kind of knowledge or skill to get something out of all this. It's almost like we need these shields, conceptual shields against all this powerful machinery being thrown at us, both conceptual and kind of technical. So with that, let's just dive in. So that's the book, and I sent out the table of contents. A lot of this stuff, I'm sure, looks like Greek. Like even 5 years ago, I wouldn't have known what a lot of this stuff was. And it was just sort of curiosity on my part that led me to kind of investigate some of these concepts. Also, if you're interested in math, sometimes you kind of look into like the origins of some math debates. Like what is the nature of a mathematical object? Are they real? Do they exist only in the minds of people, or are they platonic objects? These debates have carried on. They kind of got very heated right from the time calculus was invented, and then it kind of been accumulating more and more sort of infrastructure. So it's hard to keep up sometimes. But I think it's still interesting to kind of be aware of these debates. And computation kind of arises as a kind of the child of mathematics and practical concerns, but now it's become its own thing. So that's what this book is about. Like, what is this separate thing? Like, what is computation as opposed to everything else? And I think it's a pretty short book. So what's nice is this, we can just go chapter by chapter through it. And one thing that I noted and Himanshu noted was that he doesn't often give they don't often give like good examples of what they mean, because it's sort of like a very compressed book. So there's a sort of claim made and a couple of citations and not much illustration. So if you don't know what the long sort of debate is, it can be a little bit disorienting. But I think some of it we can try and fill in, because again, I think there's some value even with like a sort of bird's eye perspective on what's happening inside the citadel of mathematics. So the exciting kind of things that I think even like the sort of YouTube informative video level stuff to do with topology, type theory, and homotopy, I think these are interesting fuel for the imagination and could potentially influence how one makes sort of explicit plans. And how one thinks about reasoning publicly and with other people. So yeah, I think the idea is to step through this over the next few weeks and try and pull out connections. So like I said, just interrupt if there's anything that you'd like us to expand on, or just want to thrash out, because I haven't put that much here, but yeah, just jump in. So there's this line that a few of us who are here kind of cooked up once, this idea of making the latent blatant. And the foreword written by the philosopher Anna Longo kind of touches on this. So this is kind of like a bird's eye perspective on one way of thinking about rational thought or reasonable thought that used to be more common, maybe up until, say, the early part of the 20th century, and then kind of got abandoned. There was this kind of perspective on eternity, the idea that rational thought is somehow more real than the sort of specifics of and messy world that we inhabit. The most extreme version of that would be Plato's idea that the ideas themselves live in a separate universe, and that everything that we experience is like just sort of a crap version of what's in the Platonic realm. But over the course of the 20th century, particularly the second half, there have been like these sort of pushbacks against that, to say, well, machines are not the way we should think about minds, and that these ideal structures are a distraction or somehow bad. But so in a way, in 2022, it's almost an anachronism to write the way she's written here, to say, what's the use of the search for knowledge if it cannot be told as a story of a world that will survive etched in an eternal crystalline structure? You could say that this eternal crystalline structure almost offends some people who think more in terms of the transient, the interactive, and things like that. So she says she's less inclined in judging the truth of what is said or written than in wondering about the true power of producing memories of realities that have never been experienced by those who will come from another time and space. So I really like this sort of science fiction-y framing, because it's like the most extreme version of what we actually genuinely hope from rational dialogue anyway, which is that I would like to explain something to you in words and maybe with diagrams and things like that, but you probably haven't experienced what I've experienced in the specifics. So rational thought, even if sometimes it comes across as like elitist or sort of distant, there's a kind of optimism and idealism in rational discourse that comes to the fore in this foreword. It also is something that there's a philosopher named Reza Negarestani talks about in a book called Intelligence and Spirit. He's trying to kind of reclaim the progressive spirit of reason, if you like, because it's kind of received a beating for various reasons in the past few decades. So this book actually talks about a short story, which I highly recommend you read. And it's kind of, the foreword has spoilers, but basically there's a sort of robot being that creates a contraption so that they can kind of do surgery or investigate their own brain using like prisms, and they look back into the narrator looks back into their own brain. And they kind of make some discoveries about how the brain works and how that working relates to the wider functioning of the physics of that universe. And they find out that there's kind of the doom is on the way, more or less for reasons of entropy. And they express a kind of a hope that aliens who land on the planet and discover their documents can relive their lives. So it's sort of another version of so Analogo kind of pulls out that sort of end of the story. And so what's the connection with computational reason? Of all the different ways in which human beings can express themselves, perhaps reason is something that kind of helps the recipient reconstruct the conditions that, or reconstruct the original thought. That's basically the idea, that you could reconstruct. So if I teach another person some method or proof, it's not simply like giving them a hammer. It's sort of giving them a recipe for making hammers, and implicitly recipes to make other things. And that is its power. And also what people have often pointed out, that the speed of human cultural change as compared to evolutionary change has much to do with this ability, that one person can spend 10 years developing something, with lots of trial and error and all that, and then just communicate their results so that no one else has to spend all that time. So that's kind of the idealism lurking here. So what is Logiciel? It's the French word for software, and it, in true French style, came about by committee, because the French don't like to use English words if they can avoid it. So it has the word logic, and materiel or hardware, and those come together to mean software. And it's kind of a nice word because it connotes that something about bringing together two seemingly disparate things, the mental and the material. But it also, for the author Cavia, they they want to kind of look at it as sort of a pun to think of Logiciel, and ciel is the word for sky in French. So it has something to do with this idea of blue sky thinking. I generated this with DALL-E just now. but this idea that you can kind of come at things from this top-down perspective with a kind of fresh, history-free almost kind of framing of a problem. And there's that element. I once met someone who was from a software background, and he said that the constraint of software is that you start with absolutely nothing. Like you start with a blank, and you have to build the entire world from that blank using rules of some sort. So this book frames itself as in comparison to Chomsky's minimalist program. It is I don't know if it's the best analogy, because people often say that Chomsky's minimalist program is hard to pin down. When people would accuse Chomsky of not having a falsifiable theory, he says, well, theories are falsifiable, but programs are not. But the goal is a good one. Treat computation as an artifact and ask, what is it, and why does it have the unique properties that it has, as opposed to just mathematics or just calculation. So I don't know how Cavia got to be interested in this. His background is computer science, but I thought I could give some background, because most of the people here have some connection with neuroscience or machine learning kind of stuff, or cognitive science. So in 2017, some of us went through a book called Mind as Machine by Margaret Borden. It's a really good book on the history of cognitive science. And it talks about how the birth of cognitive science involved this sort of interaction among all these different fields. We often forget that anthropology is involved, and even linguistics sometimes. In the past, let's say 10, 15 years, I've gotten the impression that cognitive science has sort of become off on its own and less interdisciplinary. So whatever was produced from this early interaction kind of went off on its own. But so this, I'm not going to work through this whole timeline, but it's worth looking at. This Anna Riedel made this timeline of the cognitive sciences. And so we went through this, and basically in the 20th century, you saw psychology and computer science. Those are the two things that kind of came together to produce sort of two broad kind of children: artificial intelligence and all this machine learning and cognitive science. So there were sort of fashions and trends over the course of the 20th century, and we're still living with the consequences of this. So in the early days, well, actually, so I made a timeline of my own, which is maybe a little bit easier. I just zoomed in on part of it, which was the AI part. So you had kind of in the early days, in the 50s, you had groups of people thinking about symbolic processing, and other people maybe talking about things in a more sub-symbolic way, kind of cooperating with each other. But then by the 60s, there was kind of a split. There was what came to be known as good old-fashioned AI, which is pretty top-down and logic-oriented, and it was often dismissed as just if-then statements, which kind of is, but that's sort of unfair, because there's a lot happening with if-then statements. And then on the other hand, you have neural networks, basically, but then the whole field of machine learning, which starts more or less with Rosenblatt's perceptron, and the sort of great-grandchildren of that are the deep learning networks that are so popular now. There was a proper soap opera kind of rivalry where Marvin Minsky and Pepper wrote this book about what the perceptrons couldn't do, and they even admitted later that it was about competition for funding. And then so there was this kind of a lull in neural network research, and then the AI people meanwhile overpromised, and then there was a report that kind of criticized them, and then the neural network people came roaring back in the 80s, and they kind of peaked somewhat in the 90s, and that also sort of went away. And then in 2012, as many of you know, there was this sort of renaissance of backprop-based neural networks. And now there's a cottage industry of people writing about how all these networks don't have logic, they don't have reason, they don't have language. So navigating this, it seems like you have to pick a side, but maybe we don't. And I think part of the fun of this book is that maybe there's another way of navigating all of this. So yes, the cog side grew around the idea that the mind is a machine. And you can ask, well, what sort of computer is the mind, if it is the computer? And that's where you have this GoFi versus artificial neural networks, which loosely maps onto the distinction between symbolic and sub-symbolic processing. So the units that compose an artificial neural network are doing kind of analog processing more or less, and don't do things that seem directly related to logic, although you can kind of get neural networks to make logic, so it's a little fuzzy. And then a debate which we don't really need to touch on in this book is the pushback. So by the late 70s, and then and definitely in the 80s onwards, there were people who said, we don't like this mind is a computer business, it's too anti-organic. And then you have this 4E business. So it's embedded, embodied, extended. I keep forgetting all E's. Extended, embedded, embodied. And then there's a fifth E, which is ecological cognition. And they're all segments of what?
You missed inactive with the first.
Inactive. I always forget that one. Inactive, which I still don't fully understand what that word means. But in these cognitive science circles, you often come across these explicitly against a kind of a particular notion of mind as a symbol manipulator or as irreducibly linguistic. Those two kind of go together often. So and a lot of those people will use dynamical systems theory as an alternative. So when I was presenting all that stuff about dynamical systems, people might say, oh, you of all people, how could you be interested in all this? But the idea is that I don't think the brain is a dynamical system. I think dynamical systems theory is useful for certain things, like which we talked about, but like when the actual time course of some phenomenon is important, when you're interested in stability, like there are specific cases for which dynamical systems theory is a decent idea. But then there are types of invariants, like there are in logic and language, which are not exactly temporal in the standard way. And for that, it may be unnecessary to spin lots of wheels to run continuous differential equations. So I think there's even though people have been debating this, there's a lot of room for finding middle ground. And I think this book helps in that direction, although it's much more on the side of logic and mathematics. So the question that the book is about, he touches on and kind of gives they give a preamble to that here in the introduction. And there's a really good phrase I like here. I will examine the three canonical models of computation, mapping the influence of dominant modes of mathematical reasoning prevalent at the time of their emergence. I will come to view them as symptomatic of a historical rupture, a traumatic event in human rationality, the cleaving of reason from mind, from which a novel image of thought emerges. I really like this phrase, the cleaving of reason from mind. And it kind of gets going at the dawn of the computer science era, where things that, like once upon a time, the word computer referred to a person. And you see this, 100+ years after the debate it was inaugurated, that when say GPT-3 is able to have a conversation and seems to have at least some ability to track reason or logic or something, people are like, oh, well, but it doesn't have a mind. So this cleaving has happened, and we're still figuring out what to make of it. So these three models from the 1930s are Kurt Gödel's recursive formulas, Alonzo Church's lambda calculus, and Alan Turing's Turing machines. Now, most of the time, you'll be told when you read about this that they're equivalent. And I think from a formal perspective, they are, although I haven't looked into the details of how those proofs were constructed. So you could say that there's there are three angles, and they all kind of are sides of the same thing. And what Cavia wants to say is that in a kind of loose sense, they offer three connotations for computation, or three ways of looking at computation: the math way of looking at things, a linguistic way of looking at things, and a mechanistic or physical way of looking at things. And because of certain proofs, the differences were kind of not sort of highlighted as much as the commonality. So all three perspectives end up isolating similar types of problems that computation can work on. But yeah, so the standard view is that all three models are equivalent, and Cavia's point of view is that each model offers a different perspective. So it's like looking at a complex object from three different perspectives gives you a better sense of what it is. And yeah, so that's what this book is trying to do. And so from the perspective of these sort of
just a minor note, one of the things I think Cavia also mentions is that even though we think of them as equivalent, like the church model is not irreducible to the Turing model and things like that, right? So that's
right. So I don't know like the technical aspect of how that irreducibility is established, because I know that the Church-Turing thesis itself is not proved. It's a thesis that everything that we colloquially consider as computation can be modeled as in the Church framework and the Turing framework, and that those two are equivalent. So you could think of it as, if there are types of computation that you can list, all of them, and there's a sort of coverage by Church's theorem and by Turing's approach, they cover the same problems. That I think is the way that the equivalence is established. I'm not so clear on the Gödel angle of that. But yeah, it's a really standard kind of perspective, which is why it's kind of interesting to see that right at the beginning to kind of challenge that perspective. So I was trying to frame this, and he doesn't necessarily use this terminology, but I was thinking, again, to sell it to people. What's happening here is we're talking about computation without computationalism. So he navigates a middle way between two dogmas. One is that computational states are mental states, often associated with Jerry Fodor, but it was kind of the bread and butter of cognitive science for a long time, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And it has left a long shadow in cognitive science and to some extent neuroscience. Because when I interact with philosophers talking about neuroscience, I try to tell them neuroscientists are quite vague about their theoretical commitments. So when they say that a particular brain area is computing, they have very little in mind. It's only the computational neuroscientists, and that too a subset of them, that have something specific in mind when they say that the grid cells are computed or something like that. So the other dogma, which is sort of another extreme, is that computation is everything in the universe. And this is digital physics / digital philosophy associated with David Deutsch is a big proponent of this. Max Tegmark has this idea, is a physicist. Both of them are physicists. They have this idea that all of mathematical reality is physical reality.
They're all preceded by Konrad Zuse.
Konrad Zuse, yes. And Leibniz. So the point they make here is that Leibniz had this idea called mathesis universalis that was also in this domain. And you can possibly trace it back all the way to Pythagoras, that the essence of the universe is some sort of math. So here's something that I don't fully understand from even having read the book, but it looks like it's a standard way of thinking about these topics in computer science and in logic, which is the distinction between semantics and syntax. So if computation is the same as the mind, then all computations, or most of them, have some semantic content or meaning, because that's one of the things we associate with mental states, that they are about things. Whereas if the universe itself computes, meaning that if everything that's happening is a form of computation, then computations are sort of devoid of meaning, because they kind of cover too much. And that's a kind of ontological kind of way of thinking about computation. And then you also have an epistemology, which relates to definitely the second of those, which is formalism. The idea that computation is just arbitrary rule following, that you just pick a bunch of rules for how to move symbols around, and it's like a game of some sort. And David Hilbert is often associated with it, and it's been around for a while. David Hilbert's version seemed a little more subtle, but he did say that rather than thinking of sort of Platonic objects, we should think about what mathematicians actually do, which involve finite symbols. He was mainly bothered by infinity, which was sort of unleashed on mathematics by Cantor. This is something we can definitely talk about, because it's some fun stuff that Cantor sort of sprung upon the world, an unsuspecting mathematical community, regarding infinity and the infinitesimal. So different mathematicians had different sort of intuitions about what the content of mathematics is and what the subject matter of mathematics is. And those debates are still with us. They were quite heated even back then, in the early part of the 20th century. So Cavia doesn't like any of these positions all that much. So they have, and this is my summary, that computation is not the whole of mental activity, nor the whole of the physical universe, and engaging in computation is more than just symbol manipulation. So the book is basically about fleshing out what this amounts to, using specific models from math and computer science. Yes, so this is an interesting, I just pulled out an excerpt that it kind of gives a mission statement. Novel interpretations become possible of computation once computation is freed from these two central dogmas. One consequence traced through the chapters that follow is the notion of computation as a distinct mode of reasoning, marking out its own episteme. In Aristotelian terms, computation distinguishes itself from technique. Technique is like art, but also used for science, as a distinct logos, a word whose logic structures the conditions for the possibility of encoding reason. So sort of like a separate domain of the mind. As such, the book outlines a model of computation grounded not in static axiomatics, which I will trace to Hilbertian notions of formalism, but rather dynamic inferential acts, which follow from the constructive view. Now, this is possibly an example of something that sounds quite vague, if you're not sort of aware that he's nodding to some things of trends in mathematics. But one way of thinking about mathematics is that you start with self-evident axioms, and you treat mathematics as a subset of logic, so that everything you do following those initial axioms is just classical logic, or the derivative of classical logic. What you see happening in computer science and in math that is adjacent to computer science, involved in things like automated proof assistance and things like that, is that you don't generally start with axioms. You have a kind of looser notion where you start with some assumptions, and you have rules that are kind of inbuilt, and we'll maybe talk about that later. And so this dynamism it's quite different from the standard perspective. It's sort of computation embedded in a world that isn't just computation. I like this too. A form of informational realism will emerge as an alternative to universalism. The idea that everything is computation. So it's a view which both admits the reality of information as a matter of fact in the world, and necessarily commits to an irreducible contingency of the real. So this contingency concept seems crucial throughout this book, but he doesn't necessarily elaborate on it as much as I would like. So we'll try and come back to this. But contingency, it's basically the colloquial idea that there are some things that you kind of have to deal with as they arise, and you can't anticipate them completely. So another crucial thread is a philosophy of mathematics known as constructivism, associated with Dutch mathematician Brouwer. And initially, it was kind of sort of a backwater of mathematics, wasn't taken all that seriously. But because of computer science, it kind of came back in a big way. And it has an interesting position on the law of the excluded middle, which is a central aspect of traditional logic. So it's the idea that, so constructivism, first of all, is the idea that it is necessary to find or construct a specific example of a mathematical object in order to prove that an example exists. Now, if you've never seen a mathematical proof, you might wonder what this is about. But right from the basics that you see in, say, set theory, you start coming across existence proofs that don't actually tell you what the thing is. It just tells you that it exists. And even in the world of networks, you have proofs like this. Like for example, there's a proof showing that any deep network can be has an equivalent single layer artificial network. Karthik, do you remember what that theorem was called, or who proved that? But basically, it's something that is often talked about. That there is a set of,
it's the Harnik-Siebenko universal approximation theorem. Yeah.
Yeah. So a single layer, a single hidden layer is all you need to serve as but no one has an algorithm for making this thing. All they show is that in some sense, the weight distribution exists. So you need to kind of almost be lucky to find it. But that's very common in traditional mathematics as is taught to undergraduates. So in classical mechanics, one can prove the existence of a mathematical object without finding that object explicitly, by assuming its non-existence and then deriving a contradiction from that assumption. And that's based on a concept called the law of the excluded middle, which is that a statement has to have one of two possible logical values, true or false, and there's nothing in the middle between true and false. So it's often expressed as the statement that P or not P is definitely true. But in computer science, starting with Gödel and then with Turing, undecidability becomes a real issue. It's like you can't say whether a proof whether the program will halt, for instance. And what use then is it to insist that a statement has a true value of true or false? Brouwer was early in this, saying that certain statements in mathematics may be neither true nor false. And then if a construction is offered, then it becomes true. So before you've actually shown something to exist, there's no point in insisting that the statement is either true or false. It may continue to be undetermined until the end of time. And there are some foreshadowings of this in Indian and Chinese philosophies. Famously, Nagarjuna had a four-valued negation, where you could have something as neither true nor false and sort of both true and false. And initially, people just thought it was like sort of Eastern irrationality. But now there are these interesting branches of logic to do with what's known as paraconsistent logics that have formalized some of these non-traditional ways of thinking. And some of them are actually quite useful for computer science also, because for a program, knowing that something exists is not very useful. You kind of want the program itself, not sort of a promissory note. So yeah, so I said this before, the contingency is a crucial idea here. And it's this idea which is contrasted with what I even might have thought about as the main connotation of computation before, a kind of rigidity and determinism, that if the universe is a Turing machine, then the cosmic programmer just sets up the initial conditions and everything is just a logical consequence of that. So in a sense, the entire universe is a gigantic tautology. But it seems now there are other ways of thinking about computation. So what I think Cavia is kind of gesturing at and saying is a program, meaning that it's just the start of a way of thinking, maybe, is that if we think of computation not as the thing in which we are, but embedded in the world and in the mind, then we can recognize a sort of dialectical relationship with contingency. So the irreducible reality of events cannot be fully anticipated by any sort of reason. And that's more or less what is happening in practice anyway. You make programs to be reliable up to the point where some sort of choice point or decision needs to be made. So yeah, you need the map, but you also get to points where the map is not going to tell you where to go. And I think that's very much more true to the actual experience of computation and reason more generally, that it needs to be flexible and adjust to circumstances, but it shouldn't be so flexible that every little circumstance buffets it and moves it around. So the metaphor that came to my mind is of like flesh and the skeleton. Like a skeleton offers a certain rigidity, the flesh offers flexibility. So I think that this book is a pointer to bringing these perspectives about the organic and the sort of machine-like more close together, and rather than treating them as mutually exclusive alternatives. So yeah, that's basically the kind of preamble, and that's what's in the intro. And so I thought I'll just summarize with what are my sort of reasons for going down this road. I said this before, but the machine unconscious is one way that I like to describe what's happening with modern artificial neural networks. There's this cottage industry of people talking about explainable AI or interpretable AI. Apparently, they mean slightly different things. But people are quite uncomfortable about trusting an oracle, even if the oracle is quite accurate, if they don't have reasons. So even within places where you get success in prediction, we want something made explicit. Like, why did the machine choose to categorize this in some particular way? So there's a general interest in explicitly communicated reasons among people. Because right now, GPT cannot explain itself all that well. So it's not just a philosophy of computation, which might be a passive description of what other people are up to. But it could, in principle, be a way to enhance one's own ability to reason and reason like with this tool. From a science perspective, we often have this opinion that mathematics is the language of science. So keeping an eye on what these mathematicians are up to may be useful. So taking lessons for how they communicate reasons could be useful, because there's a lot of mistrust and reproducibility issues in many fields. And obviously not everything that mathematicians do is applicable in something like biology, but there's probably room for improvement, particularly in the theoretical domain, where you don't simply take somebody's word for it. You kind of say, well, okay, I'm going to work through this analogous steps to understand it myself. And so, like I said, yeah, including contingency is more faithful to actual practice than computational universalism. So like saying that the entire universe is math doesn't tell you how to write down a useful equation. So I think it can help us move past some debates which are getting a little bit stale regarding symbols, like to what extent does the brain use symbols or whatever, and whether there are representations and whether they are symbolic or not, and also whether the world is somehow deterministic or random. I think the impression I get from this book is that we can have much more productive investigations and by leaving these aside for a while. So yeah, so that's my pitch for the book, and next week we can dive into chapter 1. So yeah, any questions, comments?
So is it fair to say that like you might be able to use some of the ideas in this book as kind of a replacement for some of the like the Mars, hierarchy of like I mean, just like as a complete replacement for that sort of thing?
I like that idea a lot. And yes, so David Marr's idea is that the brain is engaged in 3 levels of processing. There's the implementation level, the algorithm level, and the computation level. And I don't think it's a completely wrong idea. But so basically, we often give the analogy of flying. So the idea is flying is a computation. Flapping wings might be an algorithm, and then feathers and muscles and bones might be the implementation. My main complaint with that is the in practice, that's not necessarily a great way to proceed, because you may not be correct about what you think the computation is. Like simply because you know that the organism is doing something doesn't mean that particular subcomponent of the brain is doing some specific computation. So it's much more like a feedback loop. And yes, so actually some of the stuff I read in here, I don't know whether he says it clearly, but one of the things I got from this dynamic kind of contingent approach is that other than like when you sort of commit to axioms, you're kind of saying these things are in a context-free way always true. But with here, if you're doing something in a dynamic way, you kind of throw out some ideas and then follow rules for rationally following what those rules mean. And then you can kind of go back to the drawing board. So there's this cycle that potentially is more like what research actually looks like. So yeah, I don't think he sort of explicitly nails it on that. So something that we could do potentially, in a review paper.
He makes a reference in some places to Mars layers.
Yeah, unfortunately, this book does not have an index, which is very rare. And there's no soft copy. But yeah, it's hard to escape David Marr in this world.
Yeah, the stuff he talks about, let's see, page 187, 188.
187.
The last 3 words of 187.
Oh, yeah. This gets into some technical stuff that we will end up talking about. So to do with the syntax and semantics.
So we might at least have eventually by the time we get to the end, have a launch point to talk about addressing that question that Rob had.
Yeah, but I'll just, it's short, so it's yeah, maybe we'll get there. But yeah, so yeah, there is something about that. So the thing which I didn't really mention is the topology aspect, which is a kind of guiding principle in some of these new perspectives on computer science to do with something known as type theory. And so homotopy type theory is a way to do particular sorts of math using type theory, and it also sheds light on type theory. So there's I'll send out some videos on this. There's a couple of good short videos on this, but there again there's a kind of a computational trinitarianism where logic, mathematics, and computer science, they're not just presented as equivalent to each other. And I can vouch for this even from the lectures, that when they're trying to explain a concept, some of these mathematicians will use a logic-based kind of interpretation, and in other situations will use a topological interpretation. They're always talking about the same thing. So topology is something that most people, other than math people, don't actually study, but it's sort of an extension or you could even say a softening of geometry. And because of the sort of visual aspect of it, it can at the very least provide some useful metaphors for what thinking is.
Jesse Parent has asked a very good question, where some of the recent Twitter threads about representation symbols being something to start over again about related to interest in this book again.
Well, I didn't tweet that. It was I think it was Luis Pessoa who mentioned this, And I mean, half the time, I agree that those debates are kind of getting stuck. And maybe if people saw the equivalence of the relation between the sort of dry symbolic logic, which and topology, which is in some sense about flows, they might be more open-minded about what they think is implementing symbolic process. That will involve a lot of work. It's not a solved issue at all. But I think I sometimes am very cautious about saying anything that isn't a fully fleshed out theory. Meanwhile, if you look at the history of both philosophy and physics and many fields, these broad, almost impressionistic ideas can serve as fuel for making things explicit. So that's like the thing I'll keep coming back to, which is related to constructivism. So the form of constructivism that Brouwer made popular was known as intutionism. And this is the idea, which is sort of vague, and he relates it to mysticism, which is that this idea of some sort of a direct intuition for mathematical objects on the part of an idealized observer. So rather than saying, like Hilbert, that the actual topic of mathematics is the symbols, he would rather say there are these entities that we can think of, which we don't have to think of as Platonic objects. They're in our imaginations, and we try to make them explicit. What we can say is being added now is this idea that there's a sort of back and forth relationship. I have an idea, I'm trying to make it explicit in conversation, if not in some formal way. And then very often it's only when I make it explicit that I'm able to test it properly, like see what its weaknesses are. Either, just if it has just logical content, you can definitely work through it more easily if you make explicit what it is you're trying to say. And if you're trying to communicate something to other people, it's another kind of test. Like if you have a sort of line of reasoning which sounds reasonable to you and which no one else can reproduce, then that's a red flag. So these are things that are not directly related to the neuroscience, but they could actually soften the opposition to some of this, because the communicative aspect is social. And a lot of things that people didn't like about maybe Chomsky and Fodor's way of thinking was that they were kind of like Fodor was explicitly a methodological solipsist. So there was a pure representational notion of what,
and anti-connectionist.
And anti-connectionist. Exactly. So now potentially it hasn't happened yet, but it's like somebody who has a foot in the neuro or ML world and in the math and philosophy world will have to kind of get these conversations started, which is that these flows in state space, potentially in the state space of the neurons or the state space of the weights, there could be another level of abstraction above it. That is what this type theory is getting at, and that is maybe the kind of place where we want to look for the invariance to do with language and logic. That's like the dream, to get to the point where we can articulate that and even maybe get going on it, like with simulations and things like that. Yeah, it's a fun topic.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff. Like even it's cool. This is a really nice nexus of like you kind of covered like explainability, interpretability, and reproducibility. Even like the previous slide, it kind of felt like we're mentioning like Fodor and kind of in the Twitter thread I mentioned I kind of referencing like Tony Shamaro kind of saying, yeah, this whole talk about referencing or representations maybe is kind of screwy, so maybe we should start over with it. But the thing about embedding like embedding it, I think it was 11, I think, but like in the reality and the dialectical relationship, like like it's I'm excited to read the book with kind of this being in mind. Yeah,
right. I think that like this helps. This could help people who think that being invited to think in terms of computation means to abandon interaction or abandon resonance and those things. Like even though I like the concept of resonance, there's something sort of fashionable about it, but none of this is opposed to that necessarily. In fact, one of the chapters he talks about interaction and how that, yeah, what was it? Interaction grammars. I don't remember what was in that chapter, but I think one of my experiences when I was just starting to program in Julia was that like, I had kind of been maybe swallowed too easily this idea that there's always a trade-off between efficiency and robustness. And there are many analogous trade-offs that you come across. In fact, in neuroscience, there's the stability plasticity dilemma. And you come across this over and over again. So I kind of assume that, well, if I want something to be easily readable and quick in terms of getting from idea to simulation, it should be MATLAB. And it can't be efficient or something like that. But we should actually put those ideas to the test, is kind of like, maybe we can be better at bringing seemingly opposed things together. And I think that's the challenge that I find in this. It's like, you don't have to rest on what you think is already, oh, these things are opposites of each other. Well, maybe not.
Yeah.
And maybe there are ways to bring things together. And there's something, and to use that word constructive again, like there's something constructive about that. Like instead of listing things you dislike about philosophy A or philosophy B, you're kind of saying, well, where can I find this middle ground, which is not just a halfway point, like some sort of mealy, that doesn't do much, right? But you want it to make something that actually does work in some sense.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, doesn't have to be a program or a proof, right? It could be that people learn ways of interacting that help them attend to phenomena, A, more sort of socially in common, and B, more productively, where they get, it's almost like, I'm sure everyone has had this experience where they want to talk about something, but they only talk about preliminaries. And they never actually get to anything in depth because people are constantly asking about whether the framing of the preliminaries is okay. Maybe we can, like, we ought to be able to try and do better at that. Maybe. Any other thoughts? I can stop the recording and we can talk off the record.
I guess it's a pretty general comment, but I think, you know, I'm kind of, I've been trying to understand more like the history and the current reality of the cognitive sciences or the cognitive science project. And I feel like if there's going to be anything like such a, like, if there's going to be anything that pushes that whole attempt forward, I think it's going to be a lot more integrative like this and kind of reaching out across the barriers a bit more than they have been, because they kind of, there was different attempts at integration, they didn't work, and then there was the funding stuff or whatever, but like it's sort of like where are those fertile patches where we can try to do it? And I feel like it's exciting to think about that in the context.
Yeah. In fact, part of the goal for me in talking about this in more publicly is that there's a huge barrier to entry with all this math and CS. Like it's difficult. Like even though I have a reasonable background in some of this stuff, I find it really hard. But I at the same time, I think that there's stuff to be gained from it. And I have this image in my head of like the social position given to people with mathematical skills. Like in ancient times, if you could predict eclipses, you get all this power, right? And so it's like knowing a little bit about what's happening behind the curtain, right, is useful for everybody. And even sort of reflections of how that way of thinking work could be fuel for creative thought. That's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll stop the recording.